Hey, Larkin Rose here, and I'm doing the second part in my series called Slave Think, which is based on various excerpts from things written by Frederick Douglass, mainly his autobiography, which give his account of growing up and living as a slave before he escaped mentally and physically. And to me, the mental escape was way more impressive. Now, this particular episode, even though this series is called Slave Think, would more accurately be called Master Think, because this has to do with the mentality and the behavior of the people who think they have the right to rule, in this case, the slave owners, and what it does to their psyche and their mentality and their behavior. I'm going to intersperse bits and pieces of my book, The Most Dangerous Superstition, which is all about the belief in authority, with Frederick Douglass's account of his own experiences, and see if you can notice the similarities and the patterns here. So, my book goes through the effects of the belief in authority, not just on the victims of it, but on the lawmakers and their enforcers, the people who imagine themselves to be agents of authority. So, I'm starting with a quote from my book. This isn't Frederick Douglass. This is me. Talking about the effects on those who are lawmakers, the politicians, the people who think they have the right to rule. Once someone believes himself to have the right to control others, there's little likelihood that he will choose not to use that power. And whatever noble intentions he may have had to begin with, what he will actually end up doing is using violence and the threat of violence to impose his will upon others. Once someone has been given the reins of power, and with them the supposed right to rule, the chances of that person choosing not to forcibly control his neighbors is almost none. The level of coercion and violence he inflicts upon others may vary, but he will become a tyrant to one degree or another, because once someone truly believes that he has the right to rule, he will not view others or treat others as equals. He will view them and treat them as subjects. For one to believe that he has the right to rule necessarily requires him to believe that he is exempt from basic morality. And this is why I don't ever support politics at all, or anyone getting into office. It's not going to do us any good or them any good. So, now we're jumping over to Frederick Douglass describing, throughout his story, he goes from one master to another, like, pretty many times. So he's describing the wife of his new master. These are his words. Quote, "My new mistress proved to be all she appeared when I first met her at the door, a woman of the kindest heart and finest feelings. She had never had a slave under her control previously to myself, and prior to her marriage she had been dependent upon her own industry for a living. She was by trade a weaver, and by constant application to her business, she had been in a good degree preserved from the blighting and dehumanizing effects of slavery. I was utterly astonished at her goodness. I scarcely knew how to behave towards her. She was entirely unlike any other white woman I had ever seen. I could not approach her as I was accustomed to approach other white ladies. My early instruction was all out of place. The crouching servility, usually so acceptable a quality in a slave, did not answer when manifested toward her. Her favor was not gained by it. She seemed to be disturbed by it. She did not deem it impudent or unmannerly for a slave to look her in the face. The meanest slave was put fully at ease in her presence, and none left without feeling better for having seen her. Her face was made of heavenly smiles, and her voice of tranquil music." Okay, so here comes the bad news. Here's what he says next. "But alas, this kind heart had but a short time to remain such. The fatal poison of irresponsible power was already in her hands, and soon commenced its infernal work. That cheerful eye, under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. That voice, made all of sweet accord, changed to one of harsh and horrid discord, and that angelic face gave place to that of a demon." So it's kind of profound. First of all, it's profound that Frederick Douglass was aware enough to see the harm that slavery was doing to the beneficiaries of slavery. well, in theory, beneficiaries, that it destroys them too. And the same thing is true of authority, because it's the same thing. Thinking you have the right to dominate others, not these days is not as blatant and obvious and outright as slavery, where I own you, you're my property, I can do whatever I want. But having that at all basically rots the human soul. So, now I'm jumping back to my book for a second. This is talking not about the lawmakers now, but about the enforcers. The police. Quote from my book. The primary concept that the enforcer is taught, and the primary concept that he must accept in order to do his job, is that as a representative of authority, he is above the common folk and has the moral right to forcibly control them. In short, he is taught that his badge and his position make him the rightful master of all the average people. Once he is convinced of that lie, it should be expected that he will despise the average citizen and treat him with contempt. In the same way, and for the same reason, that a slave owner will treat his slaves not as human beings, but as property, whose feelings and opinions matter no more than the feelings and opinions of the master's cattle or his furniture. Now, I'm going to jump to Frederick Douglass's description of one of the many slave overseers he had to deal with. This one was named Mr. Gore. I wonder if he was a relation of Al Gore. Don't rightly know. Maybe. Here's Frederick Douglass's description of that guy. See if this sounds like a familiar personality type. Mr. Gore was proud, ambitious, and persevering. He was artful, cruel, and obdurate. He was just the man for such a place, and it was just the place for such a man. It afforded scope for the full exercise of all his powers, and he seemed to be perfectly at home in it. He was one of those who could torture the slightest look, word, or gesture on the part of the slave into impudence and would treat it accordingly. There must be no answering back to him. No explanation was allowed a slave showing himself to have been wrongfully accused. Mr. Gore acted fully up to the maxim laid down by the slaveholders. Quote, "It is better that a dozen slaves should suffer under the lash than that the overseer should be convicted in the presence of the slaves of having been at fault." End quote. He was just proud enough to demand the most debasing homage of the slave, and quite servile enough to crouch himself at the feet of the master. He was cruel enough to inflict the severest punishment, artful enough to descend to the lowest trickery, and obdurate enough to be insensible to the voice of a reproving conscience. He was, of all the overseers, the most dreaded by the slaves. When he whipped, he seemed to do so from a sense of duty and feared no consequences. He did nothing reluctantly, no matter how disagreeable, always at his post, never inconsistent. He never promised but to fulfill. He was, in a word, a man of the most inflexible firmness and stone-like coolness. His savage barbarity was equaled only by the consummate coolness with which he committed the grossest and most savage deeds upon the slaves under his charge. Now, Frederick Douglass went through a long, horrible story of a slave being whipped who then jumped into the creek to cool his wounds, and this overseer basically pulled a gun on him and said, "I'm going to count to 3 or something, and if you don't get out, I'm going to kill you." And he didn't, and he shot him in the face and blew his head apart in front of all the other slaves. And then the master, because that was brought to the master's attention, why did you kill one of my slaves, asked why this overseer had resorted to this extraordinary expedient. Back to Frederick Douglass's words. His reply, the overseer, was, as well as I can remember, that Demby, the one whose brains he had just splattered all over the place, had become unmanageable. He was setting a dangerous example to other slaves, one which, if suffered to pass without some such demonstration on his part, would finally lead to the total subversion of all rule and order upon the plantation. He argued, meaning the overseer, that if one slave refused to be corrected and escaped with his life, the other slaves would soon copy the example, the result of which would be the freedom of the slaves and the enslavement of the whites. So there you have it, right from the violent overseer psycho, that we can't not be vicious, cruel psychos to any who disobeys, or they might end up free. Okay, last thing, I'm going to jump back to a quote, keeping that in mind, jump back to a quote from The Most Dangerous Superstition again. Keep in mind what you just heard Frederick Douglass describing. Law enforcers are always professional aggressors, subjugating the people to the will of the politicians by way of violence and the threat of violence. And anyone who does that, if he did not already have a certain degree of contempt and hatred for his fellow man, will almost certainly develop it. To put it another way, even the nicest, most friendly slave owner, if he continues to believe in the legitimacy of slavery and continues to practice it, will be committing evil and will inflict harm upon the people he imagines to be his rightful property. And he will naturally develop a degree of contempt toward the victims of his aggression and will behave contemptuously toward them. Here's the last part I'm going to read. It is very telling that many modern law enforcers quickly become angry, even violent, when an average citizen simply speaks to the officer as an equal, instead of assuming the tone and demeanor of a subjugated underling. Again, this reaction is precisely the same and has the same cause as the reaction a slave master would have to an uppity slave speaking to him as an equal. There are plenty of examples depicted in numerous police abuse videos on the internet of supposed representatives of authority going into a rage and resorting to open violence simply because someone they approached spoke to them as one adult would speak to another, instead of speaking as a subject would speak to a master. The state mercenaries refer to this lack of groveling as someone having an attitude. In their eyes, someone treating them as mere mortals, as if they are on the same level as everyone else, amounts to showing disrespect for their alleged authority. Similarly, anyone who does not consent to be detained, questioned, or searched by officers of the law is automatically perceived by the state mercenaries as some sort of troublemaker who has something to hide. Again, the real reason such lack of cooperation annoys authoritarian enforcers is because it amounts to people treating them as mere humans instead of treating them as superior beings, which is what they imagine themselves to be. These psychological phenomena are universal. Anybody given power over somebody else is going to turn into a sadistic bastard, and it's gonna rot their soul. And that's the thing I've pointed out before when it comes to law enforcement and like slave owners and their overseers, is that if you actually thought somebody was just, oh, they're just property, like if somebody owns cattle, do the people who manage the cattle, do they get like sadistic and mean and cruel and intentionally, unnecessarily violent? No. So why does that happen so often, both with outright slavery and with law enforcement? If you actually just thought that somebody was inferior to you, let's say there's somebody born with a mental handicap, are you going to be like nasty to them and intentionally sadistic and violent? Not unless you're a psycho. But even well-intentioned people, if they're put in a position where they have power over others, they turn into nasty, sadistic bastards. Why? Because part of them knows it's horribly wrong. Part of them knows it's evil. And so they have to literally hate their victims and blame their victims to try to sort out in their own head why this is okay. You must be somebody deserving of being beaten to death by cops or being whipped by the overseer, because if you're not and I'm just controlling you like that, then I'm the evil bastard. So I have to hate you in order to justify in my own head me controlling and abusing you. That's just how psychology works. It's how it worked in 1838. It's how it works right stinking now. And to read Frederick Douglass's description of what this did, not just to the slaves, but to the slave owners and their enforcers, is kind of amazing. And it shows that this is just universal. And what you call it doesn't matter. And the exact level of it doesn't change the psychology. Whether you can call it slavery, you can call it law enforcement, you can call it anything you want. If one person feels he has, and actually believes that he has the moral right to dominate and control somebody else, he's gonna turn into an evil asshole to one degree or another. And this is why when people are like, oh, we have to vote for the lesser of blood. No, the entire concept, the entire premise is evil and insane. And the fact that psychology, it's the same among, uneducated slaves with like the most horrible existence you can imagine, or rich politicians today. Human psychology stays the same. And the notion of having authority over somebody else, yeah, it abuses and harms the victim of authoritarianism, obviously, but it also destroys the souls or whatever you want to call it, of the ones committing the evil. So weirdly, cops are not only perpetrators of the evil of authoritarianism, they're also victims of it. It is destroying them as people. Like you heard, Frederick Douglass describe this sweet lady, the wife of his new master, and she turns into a freaking monster because her two options as a decent human being, when somebody says, oh, you own this person. Here's Fred. You own him. He's your property. You get to decide what he can do. Your two options are, number one, say, no, I don't. What the hell is wrong with you? This is a person. Now we can get along fine. Or accept the insane and evil premise that you have the right to forcibly dominate him and then turn into a monster in the process, which she did. And to read an account of that, in such a stark, extreme setting just shows that, yep, that's psychology. That's how it works. And that is the destruction of the belief in authority on everybody in all directions. It's not just, well, whoever's on the losing end of authority, yeah, they suffer, but the rest benefit. No, they don't. It destroys everybody on all sides. And, the most egregious examples are like outright slavery. But the same thing is true in any setting. And so I had to throw that one in, even though that one isn't even about how the slaves think. It's about how the masters think. But it's kind of about how the slaves think, because their own behavior and how they talk and act toward those claiming to be in authority determines what that person is going to be and what they're going to do. And the slave who is just like, ow, that hurts, I'm jumping in the creek to cool off. Like, that was the worst affront to this psycho overseer who then blew his head off. Because you're talking to me like I'm just a person and you're just a person. We can't have that. And I've seen videos of, including some of people I know personally, talking to cops as if I'm just a guy and you're just a guy. You're wearing a costume and doing weird, immoral things, but you're still just a guy, and I'm not going to talk to you like you're royalty or something. You're the king's guard. You're just some guy in a costume, and yeah, you have a gun, and you're unstable, and you do immoral crap and think it's okay. But just the act of talking to someone as an equal, if they don't view you as an equal, if they view you as a subject or a slave, that sets them off. Because somewhere down inside, they know you're right. They know they're not special. They don't have extra rights. Those with badges and uniforms, they know they're just people deep down inside. And the reason they become sadistic, nasty, power-happy bastards is because their psyche is trying to adjust to the fact that they know they're just people and don't have the right to do any of this. But they have to manufacture excuses, and the only excuse for abusing other people is to figure out a reason why those other people deserve it. Why they're rightfully a slave, or rightfully a legal subject who has to obey the law and do as he is told no matter what. And so it's amazing and gross and horrible to see someone who grew up as a slave observing and describing the universal patterns of human psychology. This is just what happens when somebody gains power over somebody else, which, by the way, is so brilliantly depicted by Tolkien in Lord of the Rings. And, Gandalf the brilliant wizard is smart enough to know, if you give me that power, I will turn into a monster too. Like, that's a pretty cool level of awareness. And so, I guess that's enough for this particular rant about slave think, or in this case, master think. But there's so much that's just universal and doesn't change about human wiring and human psychology that can be learned. Again, I highly suggest people read lots of what Frederick Douglass wrote. I'm just doing a few excerpts here that I think are most relevant. And again, a lot of his stories are horrible and gruesome, and they're true stories and stuff that happened. So it's not always an easy read or a fun read. But if you really want to understand how humanity and human psychology works, and why the belief in authority, whether you're a slave driver or a politician or a cop, is so horribly destructive and anti-human. Like, that's the way to learn it. Well, what happens when we apply these ideas to humanity in the real world? Do they serve us? Are they nice and considerate and we all work together? No, it turns people into sadistic monsters. So, anyway, that's enough for this rant. And there will be at least 2 more. Oh, okay. Again, the link below will show you how to sign up if you want to watch be involved in the watch party for the Jones Plantation, the global online release on August 5th. Because, and there's so many things about the movie that I'm tempted to just describe the scene, but that would be stupid. I'll let you see the movie. But it totally touches on things like somebody having power over others and what that tends to do to both sides. And like there's tidbits of all of this worked into the movie. But you can see that for yourself when you get around to seeing it. But yeah, the link for that is below. And there will be, I think, at least 2 more in this series. So, yeehaw, a most gruesome, horrible lesson in why the notion of authority in any context is horrendously destructive of humanity, regardless of how nice somebody was to begin with.